that doomsday clock they talk about was not designed in heaven. The time was set at 7 minutes to midnight and 47. Many near...
There is no possibility of conducting a frank discussion on U.S. policy in the Middle East without talking about the U.S. relationship with Israel. People are completely confused trying to explain our policy towards Syria. Doesn't make any sense. Syria a threat to us? No. Why does Bashar al-Assad have to go? Or because Obama said so, or because Hillary Clinton said so? Well, why did they say so? If you don't understand where this policy originates and comes from, then you're at sea in trying to explain it. If you look back to 1996, there was a study done for a fellow who was about to become prime minister for the first time. His name was Netanyahu. It was completed mostly by Americans. We later called them neocons. There were several prominent ones. Douglas Feith, number 3 in the Pentagon under George W. Bush. There were other people, and most of them, as I say, were Americans. Richard Pearl is the other person I was thinking of. He was head of Rumsfeld and its Defense Department's Brain Trust, his research group. So they composed this thing, and they called it a clean break, a new strategy for securing the realm. Okay, securing the realm. What realm? Well, the realm was Israel, Greater Israel, Israel that expanded and occupied territories during the 1967 war. It's very explicit. It talks about the need to make sure that Syria is pretty much blown apart. Iraq, the language is, well, Iraq is a prize in its own right. We need to get rid of Saddam Hussein, and then we'll go on to Iran and other places. It's right out there, okay? It's in black and white. It's written by Douglas Feith, Richard Pearl, and others. Now, that's 1996. Several years later, there was the Project for a New American Century, populated by the same people who decided that, we really needed to advance Israel's interests, and the first and foremost thing we do is we get rid of Saddam Hussein in Iraq. Therefore, he won't be a problem for the Israelis. Now, the Israelis, curiously enough, would have preferred us to do Iran first. Matter of fact, some of the neocons that really swagger around said, Iraq? They have no military to speak of. Real men go to Tehran, right? Say that, yeah? One of them said, Iraq is going to be a cakewalk, right? Okay. But that was the plan, all right? Now, if you fast forward to what's going on in Syria now, after we pretty much destroyed Iraq, I'm talking strategically here, but we're really talking about human beings. Not only the 5,000 U.S. troops that were killed about Iraq, but I was going to say hundreds of thousands, at least hundreds of thousands of Iraqis dead because of the war, all manner of people injured and wounded, and refugees. Well, we know about the millions of refugees internally in Iraq, externally in countries around its periphery. The same with Syria. Now, what happened in Syria? Well, 2011, there was an attempt to do kind of a Arab Spring in Syria. There had been economic difficulties, there had been drought, and there had been people that said, hey, we ought to take advantage of this opportunity in Tunisia and Cairo. Let's see if we can get a little bit more democracy here. Immediately, that was seized upon by people who wanted to do Bashar al-Assad in, including Hillary Clinton and, by extension, Obama. So what happened? Well, we started finding moderate rebels to support. Well, even Obama said 2 years ago now that talking about moderate rebels in Syria is a fantasy. fantasy, his word. All of a sudden, as if, well, like Lazarus coming out of the tomb, moderate rebels have been resurrected now, okay? We're supporting them again, except for some new qualitative difference that came about as a result of the Russian intervention. Now, the background is that we, in my view, cannot understand U.S. policy toward the Middle East, and specifically Syria, without understanding how our policymakers brag, virtually brag, not virtually, really brag, about there being no daylight between the policies of the United States and the policies of Israel. That doesn't do us any good among the Arab states out there, okay? So if that's the case, why is it that our president, Barack Obama, decided on August 20, 2012, to draw a red line, okay? Now, we all knew that Syria had chemical weapons. They were left over from when they got supplied by various and sundry. There was never any suggestion they were going to use them. It would be suicide immediately because the Israelis would nuke them or whatever. But Obama was asked a question at the very end of a press conference, sort of an unusual thing. Oh, Mr. Obama, you said that you wouldn't intervene militarily in Syria unless, you're never going to intervene militarily in Syria? And then Obama, as if reading a script, said, well, if the Syrians were to use or even just to move their chemical weapons, then I would draw a red line there, his words, okay? Then I would change my calculus, I would change my approach to Syria.
Red line for us is we start seeing a whole bunch of chemical weapons moving around or being utilized. That would change my calculus.
You know, intimating that, well, there would be U.S. military intervention. Now, who gave Obama that question and told him the answer? I don't know, but it's a safe guess it was Hillary Clinton, okay? Okay, that was August 20, 2012. August 21st, 2013, virtually a year later, there's a chemical attack outside Damascus, a place called, what's it called? Ghouta. Several hundred people died. Immediately, John Kerry got up. Well, not immediately. He got up on the 30th of August and said, Bashar al-Assad's government did this, Bashar al-Assad's government did this, Bashar al-Assad's regime is guilty of this chemical attack. Therefore, we drew this red line. Mr. President's got to act. How many times did he blame it on Bashar al-Assad? 35 times. 35. You know, you don't have to be a Shakespearean scholar to remember, you know, methinks he doth protest too much. Now, that was the 30th of August. This is the most, well, it's the strangest set of circumstances I've ever seen, and I've been around here 53 years, okay? What happens next? Well, it was very clear. The president himself pretty much said, okay, this is it. Our forces are ready in the Eastern Mediterranean. The French have their fighter bombers ready on the tarmac. And he was going to give a speech in the Rose Garden around noon the next day. I'm out in front of the White House with several other people protesting, saying, hands off Syria, don't bomb Syria, no shock and war against Syria. And I get word from inside, he's not going to do it. He changed his mind. And I was the next speaker up, and I used the subjunctive in a way that I never used before. If this is true, this would be, I couldn't believe it. But he changed his mind, okay? Now, why did he change his mind? A couple of reasons. The intelligence colleagues, our former colleagues in the intelligence committee, wouldn't go along with what Kerry had to say. The evidence stunk. we knew that the Turks were facilitating precursor chemicals right into the parts of Syria where this chemical attack took place. We knew, and we learned from our colleagues, that it was much more likely that it was the rebels themselves who did it in a classic false flag attack to mousetrap Obama into an overt war against Syria. And he was about to be mousetrapped. So the intelligence community wouldn't go along with it. Now, what else? Well, General Dempsey, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he went to the president that night on the 30th of September 2013, said, Mr. President, I hear from my colleagues in London that sarin gas that was used against outside of Damascus is not the kind that's in Syrian government stocks. So you might want to be careful about starting a war based on what looks like mousetrapping. And the president changed his mind. That was big. Now, there's lots more to this story, which shows what kind of influence Israel has over our policy, because it didn't end there. So we're outside the White House, and we get word that the president has spoken. He had been delayed because we had been making such a din that he waited for a period of quiet, and he announced that, well, what he said was this. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff has told me that our forces are prepared. We have warships in the Eastern Med. The French are ready on the tarmac. We can strike Syria at any time. But he's also told me that we don't have to do it today or tomorrow or this week or this month. We can do it at any time. And so I have decided to go to Congress to seek appropriate authorization for this strike. Whoa.
After careful deliberation, I have decided that the United States should take military action against Syrian regime targets. But having made my decision as Commander-in-Chief based on what I am convinced is our national security interests, I will seek authorization for the use of force from the American people's representatives in Congress.
Now, it wasn't just my former colleagues who were honest this time. It wasn't just Dempsey. The British, for the first time in 855 years, had voted against the war. British Parliament, right? And, wonder of wonders, it was August, right? And so Congress people and senators were home. And they learned real quick, Americans didn't want another war, okay? So there are lots of factors all coming together. But Obama decided to do the right thing. Now, he was supported by whom? Nobody. He admits it. He has said publicly that he had to go against the advice of Biden, of Kerry, everybody else, and he did the right thing. And he's very proud of it. Now, what did he also reveal recently? He revealed that the head of national intelligence, a fellow named James Clapper, came to him unannounced one morning and said, Mr. President, this business about Bashar al-Assad being responsible for the attacks, the chemical attack outside Baghdad, I just want to let you know, it's not a slam dunk. You got it, Mr. President? It's not a slam dunk. Now, the allusion, of course, is to George Tenet, the fellow who discharged George Bush's instructions to falsify, to create fraudulent intelligence on Iraq, his saying that the weapons of mass destruction evidence was a slam dunk. This was around Christmas time, 2002. So, Obama was warned. He was warned by James Clapper, the head of national intelligence, and Dempsey. I'm sure that what Dempsey said was this: Mr. President, you know, John Kerry's a wonderful guy. Strategic thinker, not so much. With all due respect, driving boats up the Mekong doesn't make you a strategic thinker. And he doesn't know what would happen on day 2 after Syria. So with all due respect, you can see what he's trying to do. Cut him off the pass, and Barack Obama did, and he's very proud he did, and now he admits that his chief of national intelligence told him it wasn't a slam dunk. Why did Clapper tell him that? Because he was faced with a revolt on the part of his intelligence analysts who refused, and this is important, who refused to do an intelligence assessment. Now, a major event like this, you always get an intelligence assessment. I mean, that's what the intelligence community is for. What happened outside Damascus on the 21st of August, 2013? We needed intelligence. Who was responsible? Our guys wouldn't do it. You know why? Because they wouldn't come up with the answer that Kerry had developed, okay? That Kerry said 35 times on the 30th of August, okay? So there was no intelligence assessment. So after Kerry got up on all the, he got up and all the propaganda stuff, and they said, well, even the stenographers of our media said, well, what's your evidence? They came up with something called a government assessment. New genre. I had been around 50 years before that. Never seen a government assessment, but to their credit, the intelligence people wouldn't do an intelligence assessment. So this government assessment, that means it was created by hacks, political hacks in the White House. Okay, so what happens next? Well, Kerry goes before Congress on the 3rd of September. So we're talking 3 days after the president decided, no, we're not going to do this, right? That's the 31st of August. And he says, we need to retaliate. We did this red line, and we got to do this. And besides, the moderates are winning, are beginning to win, got the upper hand. Now, he was before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was really gung-ho, to have this attack, just as they're gung-ho to attack anybody. So what happens next? Well, on the 4th of September, the president arrives in St. Petersburg for one of those summits, right? And on the day of his arrival, Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, the president of Russia, gets up and he says, John Kerry has said that the moderates are winning and that Bashar al-Assad was responsible for the chemical attacks outside Damascus. Он врет. Он знает, что врет. Это печально, which means he's lying. He knows he's lying. This is sad. Now, up to that time, I had been watching Russian foreign policy and the statements of Russian leaders for half a century. Okay, I have never, even in days of Stalin, seen a Russian leader call the U.S. Secretary of State a liar. But he had him dead to rights. And Obama, who arrived in St. Petersburg that day, knew he had the rights. Okay? Clapper had already told him, right? James Clapper, the head of the National Intelligence. So what did they do? Well, Putin says, look, Barack, we talked in Northern Ireland just a couple months ago, in June, about how we could manage this chemical weapons problem in Syria. Matter of fact, you know that we've got some working groups working together to figure out how we could make sure this isn't a cause célèbre, isn't a casus belli. So look, let me work on Assad. I think we can persuade him to give up his chemical weapons under supervision, and we can prove that he's given up. So let me work on it. Okay, so Obama says, okay, so he goes back to Washington. Meanwhile, Kerry's around the world, and he's in London, and he's finishing up trying to rally support for an attack on Syria, right? So what happens is that Kerry gets up in London and says, look, the red line has been violated. If we don't move against this terrible threat to us all, now it'll be too late. And then finally somebody asks him a question from the audience, last question, okay, in London, okay? This is, I think, around the 7th of September, 2013. Mr. Kerry, is there nothing that Bashar al-Assad can do to prevent himself from Syria from being shock and awed? And Kerry says very dismissively, he says, well, he could give up his chemical weapons, but that's not going to happen. He's not going to do that, right? So everybody said, oh, okay. So he gets on a plane, and he gets a call from President Obama. John, sorry for not calling you in on this, but we've got this deal with the Russians now. We've agreed that tomorrow the Syrians are going to announce that they're going to give up all their chemical weapons for destruction. So I want to check in with you when you arrive, but then I want you to go back the next morning to Geneva to conclude this agreement. These working groups that you know we had these working well, they're all ready. We can do this thing in a week. Kerry says, oh, okay. He goes back to Geneva and concludes. Now, most Americans don't know any of this. Most Americans don't know that all of the chemical weapons in Bashar al-Assad's army were destroyed on a U.S. ship specifically outfitted for destroying such chemical weapons, and the problem was solved. Now, this is key, this last little part of it. Well, two last things here. And it has to do with Israel's influence over John Kerry, over Hillary Clinton, over U.S. policymaking in general. Well, while all this was happening, there was a relatively new bureau chief assigned by the New York Times to its Jerusalem bureau, and her name was Jody Ruderin. Now, she didn't have a lot of experience in Middle Eastern matters, but she clearly had been briefed, and she's ready to do her job. And when all this stuff is going on, she says, to her credit, you know, I think I'll go ask some high-level Israeli officials what their take on this all is, what their preferred outcome is. And so she does. And she consults with some Israeli officials in power, some in retirement. And what does she find out? Well, the previous consul general in New York, the Israeli, he says, well, you know, Ms. Ruderin, it's not real, it doesn't sound really, it's kind of awkward to say it this way, but our preferred outcome is no outcome. And she says, well, traduisez, s'il vous plaît. I mean, hello? What do you mean, no outcome? He said, well, I told you, it doesn't sound very humanitarian, but it's like a playoff where you don't want either team to win. You don't want them to lose either, but you'd prefer to see kind of a draw. And she says, what do you mean? Okay, he said, well, as long as Sunni and Shia are killing each other off, not only in Syria now, but in the whole area, Israel has nothing to fear from Syria. Whoa. Now, this was the Labor Day weekend. Jody Ruderin, to her credit, wrote it all up. And wonder of wonders, it appeared in the New York Times. I can only speculate that people were off at Jones Beach for the weekend, you know. But there it is. Our preferred outcome is no outcome. So, what's the background here? In 2013, Bashar al-Assad was beginning to win, okay? He had displaced many of the moderates, bad moderates and moderate moderates, many of the rebels, I should say, from their places that they had occupied for a couple of years previous. And he was starting to make real gains. And so if you don't want either side to win, especially not Bashar al-Assad, what do? Obviously, you mousetrap the United States into overt intervention, that way assuring U.S. is not necessarily going to win, but Bashar al-Assad's not going to win either. So it almost worked. And it's really quite amazing how the president very openly advertises this as one key success in his presidency, where everybody else says, yeah, go get Bashar al-Assad. And the answer, of course, is, why? Why? Was he a threat to the United States? No. Was he a threat to Israel? That's quite a stretch. But, you know, if you think about Hezbollah and how they get armed, they get armed through Syria. If you think about Israel's worry about very near threats from Hezbollah, from Hamas and others, then they really like to have pandemonium in Syria. They'd like to have chaos in Syria. They'd like to see Syria dismembered, and they got it. Okay? Now, last thing I'll say on this is, I think, kind of interesting because it's a personal experience. I think it was like the 8th of September, around that time. I'm asked to come on CNN International to talk about Syria, and I do. I'm in this medium-sized booth, and I do my thing sort of remotely. And I come out, open the door, and I almost knocked over this little guy, you know. And they're like, oh, yeah, it's Paul Wolfowitz. Now, as an aside, I've taken a lot of training in nonviolence, and thank God for that, because it came into play there. And I didn't do what I was, as an Irishman, just ready to do to Paul Wolfowitz, who, kidding aside, is responsible for all manner of killing and death and dismemberment in the Middle East. So I said, oh, I'm sorry. And he looked at me and said, well, be careful. So then closed the door, and who's across the room but Joe Lieberman? Talk about two neocons, arch neocons, in the same room. Well, there they were. They were watching the boob tube there, some of the CNN pundits trying to make sense of how Obama chickened out on this, how he set this red line, and then nobody's ever going to believe us again. You know, it was really convincing. So I said, I'm going to hang around here and watch. Okay. Sure enough, Lieberman and Wolfowitz go off to a separate studio, bigger one, to do their interview. And I'm watching it on the boob tube. First thing Lieberman says, I don't understand the president. You know, he doesn't need congressional authorization to start a war in Syria. He doesn't need that. And of course, Lieberman and Wolfowitz went on in that vein. The atmosphere was funereal. It looked like Lieberman and Wolfowitz's mothers had just been run over by a Mack truck. They didn't get their war, and they were angry. So here's Lieberman saying, President doesn't need Congress. So McGovern digs out his little Constitution, which he carries around with him all the time, and he looks at Article 1, Section 8, which talks about the only authorization for war would be congressional, and he underlines it, and he rips out Article 1, the whole Article 1, and he goes to the elevator. Now, this is not just an elevator kind of place. This is really, really ornate, sort of like something out of Saudi Arabia, really fancy marble and so forth. And he waits for Wolfowitz and Lieberman to come out of their studio. Now, you have to know Washington culture, and namely that it's not possible, it's not permissible to forget somebody who might be important, who you see. So I came on, I said, Joe, Paul, Ray McGovern. And they said, oh yeah, all right. So I shake Lieberman's hand, I was like, now, Joe, hold on for a second, Paul. Joe, I couldn't believe you. You've been in Congress for, 24 years, and you don't know that the president needs congressional authorization to make a new war? You don't know? So here, I pulled out Article 1, Section 8 here. Paul, wait a second. Take it home, read it, and think about it, okay? And maybe you want to correct that on CNN. And then Paul's slinking away. I said, what? And then all of a sudden, the 6-foot-tall, beautiful, beautiful escort for Paul and Lieberman appears on the scene. And she looks at what's happening and she says, "Oh, gentlemen, I'm so sorry." And I say, "Yeah, well, I'm sorry too. What do you let these clowns on your show? I mean, they don't know what's in the Constitution of the United States?" Well, that was it for that. But what am I saying here? I'm saying that these archetypical neocons were down in the mouth saying spurious things on CNN about, the president doesn't need to authorize a war. And it just came into bas relief that the neocons were really ticked off because they didn't get the war that they almost, with Kerry's help and everybody else's help, almost mousetrapped the president into. Now, you could see why the president is proud of having resisted that, because there were no plans for day two, and the president has already said in connection with Libya that was a mistake. He'd like a do-over for Libya because no one planned for day two, and of course, who's supposed to be planning for day two? Well, her name was Hillary Clinton, head of the State Department. So these things are really important because they show that these people, not for reasons of U.S. national security, but for reasons primarily of what the Israelis want, are willing to craft our policy in that direction. What's the difference? What's the definition of a neocon? In my view, it's someone who has great difficulty distinguishing between the strategic interests of the United States on one hand and the strategic interests of Israel on the other. Now, everybody's entitled to their own opinion. I just don't think those people should be running U.S. foreign policy. And if you look at Hillary Clinton's pronouncements, she's going to invite Netanyahu into the White House first day in office. It's going to be that problem in spades, if that indeed what she intends.
The time was set at 7 minutes to midnight and 47. Many near catastrophes have come along the way. Now climate change is ticking several seconds off each day.